Kooyong is a wealthy electorate in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. It has always been held by the conservative side of Australian politics, that is, the Liberal Party of Australia and its predecessors. And by always, I mean from the first ever Australian federal election in 1901 until 121 years later in 2022, when Josh Frydenberg, the presumptive heir to the Liberal Party leadership, long touted as a future Prime Minister, lost the seat to an independent.
As you know, there's still thousands of postal votes to count. And so while it's
in a parliament with 151 seats, it's impossible to attribute a political party's fall from grace to one electorate in isolation. But Kooyong is special, because not only was it the seat of the likely future leader of the Liberal Party, but it's always been considered the safest of safe Liberal seats. Nobody in their right mind would assume that the home of the Kooyong Lawn Tennis Club would house constituents likely to vote anything except Conservative. Even more so when you consider Kooyong's storied history. Kooyong was the electorate of Robert Menzies, Australia's single most successful politician, who spent a total of 18 years as Prime Minister. Robert Menzies spent his childhood on the Wimmera River in a small Victorian town called Jepperet, where his family ran the general store. He moved to Melbourne as a teenager, attended Wesley College on a scholarship, and went on to graduate from the University of Melbourne with first-class honours in law, during which time he was noted as unusually bright, he wrote prize-winning essays and prose, and he exhibited the early, quote, traits of pomposity and arrogance that signposted him as a natural politician. Sure enough, after a decade in the law, during which time he became one of Victoria's leading constitutional lawyers, he entered Victorian State Parliament, representing the Nationalist Party of Australia, the predecessor to the United Australia Party, which in turn was the predecessor to the Liberal Party of Australia. These parties differ in substance as well as name, but they are united across time by their key function, that being that in the Australian two-party system, each of these parties presented themselves as the main conservative alternative to the Australian Labor Party. Menzies himself had always been suspicious of Labor, of its protectionism, its union ties, and its tendencies towards nationalisation. He considered himself a level-headed proponent of the alternative, the preservation of existing institutions and the rule of law, and the advocacy of open markets and free enterprise. However, he would not go as far as some. He was not an ideologue above pragmatism, and he supported the continued government ownership of certain public goods, such as the then railway infrastructure. Menzies was briefly Victoria's Deputy Premier, before resigning to contest the federal seat of Kooyong, this time for the United Australia Party, the new name for the new merger of Australian political movements that were not the Labor Party. Menzies won the safe Conservative seat easily, and in a swamp of less than impressive colleagues, he was immediately appointed as the Attorney-General of Australia and the Minister for Industry. When his predecessor Joseph Lyons died suddenly, Menzies became Prime Minister, on the eve of World War II in 1939. In 1941, he travelled to Britain to participate in Winston Churchill's War Cabinet, before returning to a cabinet that had lost confidence in him, forcing him to resign. After 2 years as Prime Minister of Australia, Menzies was written off by his own party, rather than the Australian public, part of a long-standing tradition of Australian political parties' tendencies to rip themselves apart from the inside before anyone else can do so from the outside. Menzies entered the proverbial political wilderness, but was immediately vindicated when his party's sacking of him turned into one of the most spectacular own goals in Australian history, with 2 independents in the House of Representatives, angered by his treatment, blocking the passage of his successor's budget and switching their support to Labor, who immediately took office and stayed there for 8 years. While he was out in the wilderness, Menzies reflected on the standing of the party that had treated him so poorly. What was the core identity of the United Australia Party? Did it have one, or was it solely defined by what it was not, that is, not the Labor Party? In his time on the opposition backbenches, Menzies began to make weekly radio broadcasts, crafting his political philosophy and sharpening his appeal to constituents. Through these addresses, Menzies scoped and targeted his future political base, ordinary working citizens who were not members of the urban elite, but were not part of the organised labour movement. Today we would call this group of Australians the middle class. In his most famous address, Menzies called them the forgotten people. I do not believe that the real life of this nation is to be found either in great luxury hotels and the petty gossip of so-called fashionable suburbs, or in the officialdom of the organised masses. It is to be found in the homes of people who are nameless and unadvertised, and who, whatever their individual religious conviction or dogma, see in their children the greatest contribution to the immortality of their race. The home is the foundation of sanity and sobriety. It is the indispensable condition of continuity. Its health determines the health of society as a whole. To this group of Australians, Menzies pinned both his ideology and his political hopes. In the forgotten people, Menzies found a way to identify and rally the majority of non-Labor aligned Australians under a common banner. And to his forgotten people, Menzies directly communicated his own beliefs in the supremacy of classical liberalism, of individual freedom, of personal responsibility, rule of law, private enterprise, and the family as the central pillar of Australian society. We believe in you and your children, Menzies said, while Labor believe in violence and tyranny and their weird Russian communist friends. Building on these foundations, and with the increased urgency caused by Labor's crushing victory in the 1943 election, Menzies called a conference of the United Australia Party and all the other non-Labor aligned political movements currently in orbit around Australia. He proposed another merger of these movements, and in doing so, he created, in the place of the United Australia Party, the new Great Australian Not Labor Party, one that explicitly referenced his own personal philosophy of classical liberalism. The new Great Australian Not Labor Party was now to be titled the Liberal Party of Australia. In America, liberal means left-wing and non-conservative. When American conservatives use the word liberal, they use it as a pejorative. But in Australia, to be liberal is to identify with the market-based classical liberalism that the Labor Party at the time stood against. Hence in Australia, the natural home of the Conservative is the Liberal Party of Australia. As its predecessors had done before, the Liberal Party formed a coalition government with the then Country Party, now known as the Nationals. These parties have been intertwined since inception and have generally worked together at each level of Australian politics, with Menzies' Liberal Party representing the forgotten people of the middle-class suburbs of Australian cities, and the Country Party representing, strangely enough, Australia's agricultural sector, who also had no natural home in the organised labour movement. There has always been an interesting tension at the heart of this Liberal National coalition. While united in their social conservatism, their opposition to unions, their acceptance of mining and development, their anti-environmentalism and their promotion of free trade, the Country Party, and the Nationals now, have also had a tendency to advocate for selective socialism. The Nationals oppose tariff protection for manufacturing and service industries, but have also advocated for that very same tariff protection for Australian agriculture. The Liberal Party have compensated for these demands over the years, compromising ideologically to their junior member to preserve the shared bond at the core of the coalition's unity, that they are both not the Labor Party. And while not being the Labor Party was not a new trope or message communicated by the new Liberal Country Coalition after it formed in the mid-1940s, its message under Robert Menzies was now clearer and more crystallised than before. The Liberal Party especially had defined its base. It didn't target the urban elites, whose vote had nowhere else to go anyway. For better or for worse, it took these voters for granted, relying on the coalition's predisposition towards lower taxes and fewer trade barriers to keep them on side. It did, and it allowed Menzies to speak rather more directly to his suburban, forgotten people. Menzies united them under a shared identity that, while loose, had previously not been categorised at all. And this targeted messaging bore significant electoral reward. On the back of his forgotten people, Menzies rose from the political dead and led the coalition into the 1949 election, weaponising outgoing Labor Prime Minister Ben Chifley's flailing attempts to nationalise Australia's banking system, which had further served to unite the middle class against Labor. Menzies shot his shot and was re-elected as Prime Minister in 1949. He remained Prime Minister until he retired in 1966, handing the reins to his chosen successor, fellow Melbourne lawyer of questionable swimming ability, Harold Holt. For nearly 80 years, the Liberal Party of Australia has been defined by what it's not, that is, not the Labor Party. This shadow identity means that the Liberals are doomed to reactivity. They've had to constantly shift their message, selectively narrowcasting or broadcasting, to whatever constituents it can hoover up once it considers them to have fallen outside the bounds of what defines a Labor voter. In the 1940s, and for the decades following, this was easy. The natural members of the Not Labor Party were anybody not aligned with the organised labour movement. Labor themselves tended to narrowcast to this movement, and it's important for their current base to not forget this. Labor have not always pitched themselves as the socially progressive, inclusive alternative to the conservative side of Australian politics. They formally supported the White Australia policy until 1967, including while Menzies and Holt were actively working to dismantle it. This isn't historical relativism or selective memory, it's a fact, and it shows how far and fast political sentiment can shift, including within a defined political movement. Labor supported the White Australia policy because in the 1940s, 50s and 60s, they narrowcasted to the white members of the organised labour movement with a clear message. We'll keep you strong, supported and safe from external, non-white competition that will push down your wages. Fortunately for the Liberal Party, this left them plenty of room to gather constituents. With Labor struggling to market their political message beyond the organised labour movement, the Not Labor Party was able to gain votes from most of the middle class, the majority of rural voters, wealthy elites and big business, small business owners, and anybody else scared of communism. This base of Not Labor support was wide, and consequently the Liberal National Coalition was able to keep its message broad and hazily defined. And until the 1970s, this broad church was electorally unstoppable. Voters opposed to Labor were so widespread that the lack of a unifying banner was not enough to stop the coalition from holding continuous office all the way from 1949 to 1972. But then, in the 1970s, things became harder for the Liberal and National Coalition. Since the 70s, Labor have broadened their political appeal beyond the unionised working class. First, Gough Whitlam came along and more clearly defined Labor as the more socially progressive of the two major parties, and as such, won the votes of both minority and marginalised groups, along with inner-city progressives who made electoral decisions primarily along social rather than economic lines. America had just had the civil rights movement and social change was in the zeitgeist. Labor capitalised on this, leaving the coalition, with its conservative roots, comparatively flat-footed. Whitlam's Labor let Australians redefine their vision of what Australia could be, but, for better or worse, 70s Labor was unable to paint itself as the party of responsible economic management, a title retained, for better or worse, by the Liberal National Coalition. Whitlam's Labor didn't help themselves on this front by presiding over an economy in which it allowed inflation to hit 17.6% on the back of massive government spending, and by then attempting to bypass standard treasury procedures to borrow money from the Middle East with the assistance of a Pakistani banker.
Authorised M. Young, Ainslie Avenue, Canberra, for the Australian Labor Party.
Yet in the 1980s, this too changed, with the economic rationalism of Labor leaders Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, both of whom initiated a series of reforms to increase Australia's global integration, to reduce protectionism, float the dollar, and to deregulate the financial sector. Hawke and Keating initiated superannuation and struck an agreement with unions to reduce pressure on wages. The only thing that has prevented broader electoral success has been the Labor Party's tendency to serve as its own worst enemy. After the Hawke-Keating years came to an arguably natural close, Labor found itself caught flat-footed during John Howard's prime ministership, allowing Howard to present himself as a strong leader on flashpoint issues such as terrorism, immigration, and gun control. Labor allowed unhinged, unelectable thugs to ascend to the party leadership, and after gaining government back in 2007, contributed again to the long-standing tendency of Australian political parties to rip themselves apart internally before anyone else can do the job for them. These facts aside, Labor have still been able to poach much of the Liberals' traditional base over time, including through the 2010s and early 20s. As Labor have strengthened their appeal and learned the consequences of internal disputes spilling into the public realm, they have gradually broadened their base. Labor's traditional working class unionised base is now jumbled into a cocktail of social progressives, public servants, and non-unionised middle class workers who have made the switch over time as the mantle of responsible economic management has become harder to clearly ascribe to the Liberals. This has left the Liberal National Coalition with a more narrowly defined base of rural voters, wealthy Australians in high tax brackets, business owners seeking to minimise their tax burden, and social conservatives. No matter what your thoughts are on John Howard's policies, he was politically skilled. He was able to keep this slimmed down band of rural voters, tax minimisers, and social conservatives defined and united across multiple election cycles, and he added to their numbers by himself poaching part of Labor's traditional base, the working class battlers. As Labor chased the environmental and progressive vote through the 90s, and as Keating focused on big picture issues such as republicanism and engagement with Asia, Howard made a symbolic pitch to the working class. It's hard to see which of his policies directly benefited the group that came to be called Howard's battlers, but, no longer feeling at home in the Labor Party, they helped the Liberals make up some of the ground they had lost in 1996. John Howard was able to keep enough of the Liberal Party's traditional broad church united under the banner of not being the Labor Party, long enough that the party survived in its traditional form until 2007, when Kevin Rudd came along. Thanks to Labor's aforementioned reliability and serving as its own worst enemy, the Liberals under Tony Abbott took back the Prime Ministership in 2013, after which Abbott was rolled internally by Malcolm Turnbull, who was subsequently rolled by Peter Dutton, who everyone immediately agreed was so electorally toxic that they allowed Scott Morrison and his small band of Pentecostal buddies to take the Prime Ministership instead. Which leads us to 2022. In 2022, something important changed. The coalition no longer had just the Labor Party to worry about. It had a second fight to wage in addition to that with its historic rival of Labor. A new challenge that had in fact been biting at the Liberal Party for years, and which finally reared its head in the 2022 election.
I'm a huge optimist about Australia's future, but projecting national strength requires unity and stability.
The lack of a broad identity beyond not being the Labor Party finally came back around for the Liberals in 2022, thanks to the collective realisation on the part of the Australian public that while the Liberals are indeed not the Labor Party, the range of smaller parties and independents running that have grown in influence over time are also not the Labor Party. In 2022, Labor and the range of smaller parties and independents unintentionally worked together to divide and conquer the Liberal Party's former base. As Labor's economic rationalism and centre-left progressivism pecked out young urban professionals and public servants, the Liberals were left with varying messages that it had to narrowcast to various distinct bases rather than to a single broad non-Labor church. The problem is, it's hard to narrowcast the different segments of a broad church when there are a bunch of smaller groups happy to narrowcast to a single segment of that church. Not wanting to offend the sensibilities of urban elites, the coalition ran moderate candidates in wealthy inner city areas, proposing strong action on climate change and a modern approach to social issues. But this modern liberal approach came without any policy foundation, lest it upset the socially conservative voters on the right of the party, to which it sent a different message, with National Party politicians with university degrees who used to work at the Productivity Commission dressing up and pretending to be coal miners and hanging out with right-wing cigar-smoking Sky After Dark talk show hosts. Unsurprisingly, in an attempt to be all things to all people, the Liberal Party looked disingenuous. Voters on the right moved in greater numbers to right-wing parties such as One Nation and to Clive Palmer's United Australia Party, who more freely advocated against multiculturalism, environmentalism, and action on climate change. The same climate change which One Nation had previously stated to be part of a UN plot in its policy platform. These voters saw the coalition's attempts to win moderates in inner city seats, and they thought, this party doesn't stand for me. Pauline Hanson and Clive Palmer's parties received over 1 million combined first preference votes in the 2022 election. But it was the reverse that really ripped the coalition apart. Inner city voters, who would otherwise vote for the coalition's economic liberalism, saw the leader holding up coal in Parliament and telling the opposition not to panic. They saw the policy vacuum around its hollow net zero by 2050 pledge, its lack of action on an integrity commission, its inertia around the pandemic and the bushfires, and they correctly thought, this party doesn't stand for me. When the government weaponised China's increased aggression as a national security issue, but failed to distinguish between the Chinese and the Chinese government, Chinese voters thought to themselves, this party doesn't stand for me. And perhaps more than any other cohort, there was one significant population of Australians that really got Scott Morrison in the end. Women looked at a government who had next to no women in cabinet, and they beheld a leader who bullied female business leaders into quitting their jobs on the floor of Parliament, and who on a weekly basis was accused of bullying by a series of his own current and former female colleagues. Women across Australia, from the CBDs of Melbourne and Sydney to the Red Centre, looked at this spectacle and thought to themselves, you know what? This party doesn't stand for me. As the formerly broad church of the Liberal Party of Australia imploded under the weight of its internal contradictions, a lot of voters switched to Labor, who ran as a safe alternative, rather than as a party of bold reform as it had done so in its failed 2019 election bid. Scott Morrison's personal unpopularity allowed Labor its own turn in the invisibility cloak, running on a platform of not being the Liberal Party. Voters had no reason to believe that the Liberals' fallback claim as the party of responsible economic management held any water on the back of record debt, vaccine and submarine procurement disasters, and past election promises that showed pork barrelling on an industrial level. On the back of all these facts, the Australian population finally felt safe to vote against the internal contradictions that have become all too visible in the Liberal National Coalition. For the voters who couldn't bring themselves to identify with Labor, they also had another choice.
What we have achieved here is extraordinary. Safe Liberal seat, two-term incumbent, independent.
Teal is the colour you get when you mix blue and green, and in 6 blue ribbon Liberal seats, 6 green-minded independents, who by all measures should be part of Menzies' broad church of non-Labor aligned Liberal voters, voted out allegedly modern and moderate Liberal incumbents. These seats were formerly the safest Liberal Party seats in the country and included some of the wealthiest beachside suburbs of Australia's major cities. They also included Kooyong, Menzies' own seat, and previously the seat of future Liberal Party leader Josh Frydenberg, who lost to independent Monique Ryan. And it wasn't just these new Teal independents that ripped away Liberal voters from their former heartland.
This was a Green slide. More people turned to the Greens than ever before, and I am so delighted.
The Green vote has long been a thorn in the side of Labor's left flank, but in 2022, voters in the seats of Ryan and Brisbane elected the Greens to represent Liberal incumbents, bypassing Labor entirely. The Liberals tried to compensate for all these losses by going after the outer suburbs of the mortgage belt, by retargeting Howard's battlers, but this time the message rang hollow. Voters had had enough. The broad church of Robert Menzies was no longer a viable platform in the face of special interest candidates who could tear away chunks of this base until the Liberal Party was left with what it has now, a hollowed out collection of moderates and social conservatives who can still parrot their shared love of liberal values and a strong economy, but who have no policy credibility to back this up, who hate each other, and who now have little reason to remain united, besides the fact that they're the only remaining fragments of a visionless party that never moved beyond its original reason for existing, not being the Labor Party. What does the future hold for the great not Labor Party of Australia? In the first instance, they would be well advised to consider what they now offer the Australian people that they can't find anywhere else. The Liberal Party has been rejected in the inner city and mid-urban rings of Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, along with nearly the entire state of Western Australia. The Liberal Party now faces a true crisis of identity, with its broad church now an empty Hillsong venue and event space. Kooyong's voters have been all but disowned by their own state Liberal MP Tim Smith, who says the coalition needs to, quote, stop obsessing with the woke causes of the inner urban elites and focus on the suburbs. Tim Smith, who is set to retire after crashing his luxury car while nearly 3 times over the legal blood alcohol limit, described his constituents in the inner city as loud, entitled and privileged. He holds that it is a global phenomenon that the wealthy inner urban elites are voting for the left. The problem is, the Liberal Party needs those people. Credlin and Smith's forgotten people on the outer fringes of Australia's major cities are synonymous with John Howard's battlers of 1996. But in 96, the inner urban elite still voted Liberal anyway. In 2022 they didn't. Howard needed them to win, as well as these battlers. Without them, he would never have become Prime Minister. The mathematics are simple on this. Unless I'm missing something, the coalition has nothing to gain electorally from going further right. The coalition didn't lose seats to right-wing minor parties. Australia's preferential voting system sees those preferences flow back to the coalition anyway. And I struggle to understand which Australians who voted Labor or Independent this time will want to convert to the Church of Sky After Dark should the Liberal Party go further to the right. The problem is, all the moderate voices in the Liberal Party are gone. They've been left unemployed thanks to the Green and Teal wave, leaving Peter Dutton as the only viable option as leader of the Liberal Party. If the media rebrand immediately after the 2022 election loss is anything to go by, Dutton is ready to unleash the real Peter, actually a pragmatic voice of reason, and nothing to do with the old Peter that was Immigration and Defence Minister. We'll know that he's succeeding when the coverage on Sky After Dark stops being quite this favourable.
Well, I've got some news for you. Because, my fellow Australians, welcome to the first meeting of the new resistance. It's here each and every night at 8 o'clock. It gets stronger by the day.
If the positive Sky coverage keeps up, however, and Dutton drives the Liberal Party further from its disillusioned traditional blue ribbon supporters, it's going to be an interesting ride. Listening to those partisan voices in the media is what broke the broad church in the first place. The time may have finally come for the Liberal Party to find a new identity beyond the one it has held for nearly 80 years. That is, not the Labor Party. And a good starting point would be to listen to what the voting public of Australia have said. Significant analysis of this shouldn't really be required, because when enough of the voting public of Australia stands up and says, "This party doesn't represent me," the implications should be clear.